Welcome to this panel discussion in the impact track of Spark 2021. Our topic is purpose-driven strategy. What can leaders do to embed sustainability in business strategy and operations? When purpose is embedded in the business strategy, we would see its impact with all the challenges that we are facing today, whether it's climate change, income inequality, depletion of natural resources, human rights issue, fair working conditions, pollution, financial instability, and of course, the global pandemic. I'm delighted to have two speakers here with us from different industries, from Tata Motors and from VMware, who would be sharing their perspective on this topic with us. So I'd now like to welcome Ram from VMware. And just to introduce Ram, he's a global leader focusing on data-driven digital product innovation spanning consumer and enterprise markets. In his current role, he leads as a VP Technology and Managing Director at VMware India, where he leads strategy and growth for VMware's largest global center outside of its headquarters in Palo Alto, USA. This includes working closely with the company leadership on portfolio management, talent strategy, and positioning VMware as a leading organization in India. He also serves on the board of directors of VM Software India Private Limited. Prior to joining VMware, he has served in global leadership roles at eBay, Yahoo, and Microsoft. Ram is also very active at the NASSCOM, being an executive committee, part of the executive committee of NASSCOM, and recently the chairperson of the NASSCOM Product Council. So welcome, Ram. Happy to have you here with us.
Thank you, Sumit.
Our other panelist for today is Mr. Kutty. Mr. Kutty is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Tata Motors and heads the CSR and sustainability verticals. Having been associated with Tata Motors since 1983, Mr. Kutty has worked in leadership roles across various functions, including manufacturing, the Engineering Research Center, strategy and business planning. In his immediate previous role, he was the head of vehicle attributes and technical services and successfully led the migration to BS6 emission norms, NVH, IPR, innovation, and development of India's first 5-star safety rated car. Very happy to have here with us, Mr. Kutty. So welcome, Ram and Kutty. So our topic is about purpose-led driven strategy. In the earlier panels that we have had today, they have spoken about the importance of sustainability. Suffice it to say, today, it's not just profits and making money, which is important. It's also about doing good, solving for social, environmental, economic problems with the right governance, which makes companies not only successful, but also ethical and sustainability. So research has shown that high ESG rating companies outperform in the market, whether it's attracting talent, attracting consumers, or winning the public goodwill, because there is so much more consciousness of sustainability in the marketplace. Additionally, building a responsible brand, opening new markets opportunities, and driving more efficiency. And of course, it always helps to be on the good side of the regulators and investors and analysts. So building in sustainability in your business strategy is actually a competitive edge and hence makes a very strong business case. So with that, I would like to ask my first question of Mr. Kutty. Tatas are known for the sustainability initiatives, and one thinks of Tata Motors, one thinks of the entire product life cycle. So which aspect is most important from a sustainability perspective? And could you share how that would have changed to align with the ESG requirements?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to this large audience. For us, sustainability has been embedded into our product portfolio, into the way of thinking. And for us, sustainability is a way of life. Now, in order to bring context to this, ESG is a huge topic. It covers multiple facets. It covers things across HR practices. It covers things across the products. It covers things across the supply chain, end of life, and so on and so forth. But normally when we talk about mobility and when we talk about sustainable mobility, what we really have to accept and understand is that the man is not for a car, but the car is at the disposal of the human being. Over many years of mobility solutions being available to mankind, mobility solutions have overtaken the fundamental position in our lives. So today we have cities which are designed for cars, homes which are designed for cars. You have streets which are designed for cars and less for human beings. And therefore, sustainable mobility essentially starts with having a product that is at the service. It doesn't become the master, but it is a service of a person. Now, in order to deal with the subject, I would like to talk to you about what we consider most important in sustainable mobility. And at the center of this is something related to safety. And we at Tata Motors are really, really proud to be associated with the safety agenda for making cars and mobility solutions safe for the Indian roads. So, Megha, if I may request you to kindly put on the slide, let me also bring to your attention that India is actually infamous largest number of accidents in recorded history per year. As we speak, I have to tell you, over a full 365-day period, we lose about 150,000 people. And this is from fatalities. And the number of grave injuries and major setbacks that happen to the Indian population would be multiple times that number. If I were to include the number of animals who are killed on the roads, it could be multiplied by a very, very big factor. So all this is making sustainable mobility the heart of a safety and a mobility and a sustainable question. So as you could see on the slide, over the past several years, we have been doing a lot of research in this particular area. And right in 1997, when safety was not even talked of, our very wise and erudite chairman, Mr. Tata, had thought of establishing a crash test and a facility that we would at one point of time use for making very safe cars. Over the last few years, especially in the year 2020, 4 of the top 5 cars in India, which are the safest cars, come from Tata. So this was a protracted journey towards creating safety, which means that we are creating solutions which is at the heart of the safety and the mobility question. Having said that, sustainability is not only about safety. It covers many, many aspects of what type of products you produce, what are the types of tailpipe emissions that you create, how do you manage your factories and operations, how do you manage the supply chain, and how do you have structures and policies that define the ESG agenda, both in terms of HR and also in terms of governance practices. As we go through this conversation, ma'am, I'll take this opportunity to delineate to the larger audience what is it that we are doing in Tata Motors to embed sustainability into our site. Sustainability is not done by a set of people. It is not done by a small part of the organization, but sustainability is something that has to pervade in the psyche of everybody in the organization for it to be successful. As we are moving towards Glasgow later this year, and based on the Paris Protocol, which was signed earlier, there is a lot of conversation in the public space. I will deal with this topic as we go. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you, Megha.
Thanks, Mr. Kutty. Very well said. So over to you, Ram, because while Kutty was talking about the automotive sector and supply chain and the many different aspects of sustainability, tell us how you look at sustainability from an IT sector perspective, because I'm sure there would be equal opportunities to see how IT sectors can contribute towards sustainability and drive some of the innovation and digitization. So it would be great to hear how VMware has brought sustainability to life as part of its goals towards achieving the ESG.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Sumit. And the way, VMware is a digital infrastructure company, and we power the digital infrastructure of over 500,000 companies around the world. including some of the very, extremely large companies. And, Tata Group is a very good customer of ours as well. So we span a wide range of domains and, wide range of industries. Now, VMware's approach to our ESG 2030 agenda is about embedding the goals into our business and align it with our core business strategy. So we don't see this as a separate initiative that we have to do as a separate agenda. It's built into our strategy, and we believe that this will ensure meaningful impact and lasting value, not just for us, but also for our customers and for the larger community. And our focus on the strategy is about driving three outcomes. One is trust, second is equity, and third is sustainability. So sustainability is really one component of the way we think about this from a larger perspective. And to approach this, we look at embedding sustainability into our product innovation, not just for ourselves, but for our customers as well. And then we also are, working with our customers to achieve zero carbon clouds. As cloud, every company is becoming a digital company. And so we are working with them so that they can achieve their goals as well of zero carbon emission. And when we deploy our software for them, but we know that we can't start with that. We have to start with ourselves. And we are getting into that, and I'll talk about this as we go along in terms of specifically what we are doing on our end to actually be able to do this. The second area is around human capital, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we are doing, we have a number of initiatives. As you know, Sumit, we've been working on areas like returnship models. We've been looking at areas for our own employees. How do we, particularly in the last few months, that has come to, really to be the highlight in terms of how do we do this for not just for our employees, but their families, and how do we actually, make it, help them through this process. And then the third, but last but not, is about climate change. How do we think about this in terms of our own operations? What is it that we can do, including things like, utilization of electric vehicles? When the office was still open, all of our pickup and drops with EVs. We look at renewable energy. 80% of all our India operations from our offices are powered by, with sustainable power. Etc. And the elimination of single-use plastic, we have none in our offices. We have completely eliminated that. We 100% recycle. So it's a bunch of different things that we do, as an operations of our own organization. So I think we'll talk about this as we go along. But I just thought I'll give you a flavor of how we think about this overall, ourselves, our customers, and our largest stakeholders.
Thanks for sharing, Ram. And I think that goes without saying, because today the world is so interconnected and we are so interdependent on each other. So unless you get the entire ecosystem together working on this, it'll be very difficult to achieve the sustainability objectives. Kutty, I wanted to reach out to you because you talked about supply chain. And I think it'll be great to hear from you on how you actually monitor and engage with your supply chain on sustainability factors. Because I guess somewhere when it's within your setup, it's easy to do. But when you're dealing on the whole supply chain side, how do you monitor, engage, and how do you help and support on the entire supply chain?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sumit. So let me just deal with this in the context of the automotive ecosystem. And it's very important for us to recognize that, sometimes what we see is not the real problem, and the problem is somewhere else. So normally one would worry about supply chains, somebody would worry about factories, and somebody would worry about products. So in order to put this in context, let me just explain to you something called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, on the basis of which we really come to understand what are the emissions created by us, either through products or through our plants or through machineries that we put into operation. So if you were to typically look at an automotive industry, the conclusion is as follows: that the scope 1 emission is normally related to the amount of fuel and other things that we use in the industry inside the factory. Scope 2 is about the electricity that you consume, and therefore it's about the coal or fossil fuels that you burn in order to convert it to electricity. And the third bit, which is actually consisting of 15 different elements related to scope 3, and of that, there's an element called C11, which talks about tailpipe emissions. And mind you, this is a big challenge, and we need to recognize that of all these emissions that an automobile industry generates, greater than 90 to 95% of the emission comes from the tailpipe. Something that we probably know, but we probably think that the smoke coming out of the chimneys of a factory are more relevant than the tailpipe emissions. And the very fact is, when we churn out vehicles in large numbers, these emissions that come out on the vehicle on a day-to-day basis is that which is significant compared to the amount of emissions that we create in the factories. But that said, since your question was specifically related to the supply chain, and the supply chain emissions would, in the manufacture of a product, be significantly lower than the tailpipe emissions. But dealing with something inside the factory is probably easier than dealing with a large number of distributed tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s, and tier 4s, and even beyond, in how they manage the entire ESG space. So over the past several years, we have created a number of teaching, learning, and understanding mechanisms where our suppliers are brought up to speed on this. But we also have to recognize something very important. That, earlier there was always a feeling that the OEM is a very strong entity, a very capable entity, and the suppliers are probably not as much. But these days, tier 1s and tier 2 suppliers are equally capable. They speak the OEM agenda, they speak the language of the OEMs. They are extremely mindful about climate related questions. And therefore, they have their own ESG agenda which runs those corporations. All that we have to therefore do when we are dealing with such companies, especially companies which are learned, companies which are wise, and companies who are already connected with the larger ecosystem, is to prompt them to see things the way we do in some of the areas where perhaps they have a different point of view, which is very rare. And therefore, it's alignment of goals. And once the goals are aligned, whether it is related to carbon neutrality, or it is related to reuse, recoverability or reuse or recyclability of products, or it is related to preserving, the beautiful nature around us. Most of our suppliers are very well aligned with the Tata philosophy, and we've been working with the suppliers for many, many years. And therefore, the good news is suppliers teach us many times we teach them, and collectively it's an ecosystem that is on this journey of ESG. That said, we have a cell that monitors this. We have clear targets towards this. For example, even in the due diligence of connecting with companies to be a supplier to us, we will be very sure that there's a ESG audit before we have them becoming part of our ecosystem. We monitor their water use, the electricity use, their carbon use, the response of their systems to CSR. We also see that it is not just a business case that we always look at. And therefore, it is a long-term stakeholder engagement that we have over so many years. And therefore, apart from teaching, learning, and advocacy or audits, it's also about a relationship that we build along with suppliers, which is whether it's in India or abroad, which is fundamentally based on something which is trust, something which is based on mutual understanding of the ESG space, and also respect for the environment and even beyond. So that is how we really build the ecosystem. And I think all of us are now beginning to realize that we are not independent beings. We are all interconnected beings in various ways. So gone are the days where we can probably be very proud that we are independent. We can live in this system all by ourselves. This is a connected ecosystem. And therefore, if there is child labor which is being used in some parts of Africa, which goes into our tier 4 materials, then we are very mindful that we will not use those materials. Or if there's some labor practices which are being followed in some parts of the world from which we get material, we'll probably not use those suppliers. So we have got all these very strict regimen that we are putting in place. There's scope to do far, far more than what we are doing. And as we progress in the space over the next few years, we will see that we are only making ourselves more accountable to these fundamental beliefs that is very close to human nature and to mankind. So, Sumit ma'am, that was my immediate response. And if there is something more, then we can add to the conversation.
Sure, thank you. That was really helpful. And I think think when you have so much stringent criteria for all your suppliers and partners who you deal with, I'm sure they'll be needing a lot of help. So I'm turning over to Ram to see what help and support you would provide to all your clients and customers and potential suppliers and partners to, say, other industries, to help them with meeting some of these goals. Is there any particular area that you focus, whether it's your technology, infrastructure, services?
Yeah. So absolutely. I think, like I mentioned earlier, the way we think about this is how do we accelerate productivity and carbon efficiency for customers and their digital operations? I mean, that's what we do. We do digital operations. The origin of VMware over 20 years ago was as a company, what we call virtualization, which is essentially the ability to use physical devices a lot more than what they're capable of otherwise, right? I mean, that was our origin. And of course, we've come a long way since then. But even that was an ability to actually recycle and reuse hardware and power consumption and cooling and everything else that comes with digital, which is which is hidden from most people, but that is an extreme driver of carbon footprint, right? So one of the things we've been working on with our so that's one part to it. The second one is how do we enable transparency on our carbon reduction impact of VMware solution. So we do we do a regular audit. We are able to then publish out what is the impact that we are able to drive on a positive level for carbon emission reduction overall for our customers and for ourselves, right? And then the third is how, like I said, how do we transition our own operations? And to that end, what we have started doing internally, for example, software development by itself generates a lot of consumption. Just because the way that the process of software development works, it's a trial and error process to a large extent, and you have to keep running your when you build software, you're literally building on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis at various levels of the organization. For large organizations, this can really add up. So one of the things we've started doing is how do we bring that forward to our own developers and show them what is the impact of their practices on carbon emission, right? So we're building dashboards internally that people can see. If I'm a software developer, I can see how much carbon footprint I am generating for myself by just my own practices, by not being thoughtful about how I work. The second area that we have worked on is sustainability. Internally, we've been running a lot of hackathons, etc. In that space to start to say, okay, how do we be mindful about this and what more can we do from an innovation perspective to help drive a lot of these kinds of areas. And so all of this kind of folds back into our own products that then goes out to customers, and then we are able to show them, what is the utilization on their end and what kind of impact that they have. So that's one part. The second part is on the human capital piece that I talked about. And here, VMware follows something called citizen philanthropy. We don't do things which our employees are not involved in, right? So even from our CSR or giving efforts, we only start to fund organizations where our employees are donating their time. And that kind of has a positive effect because people donate their time for various causes, and they can use up to 40 hours a year for, on these kinds of activities. They gain, points for that, and those points are redeemed against their organizations that they partner with. So there is a positive effect and a flywheel effect of this from a citizen philanthropy perspective. Linked to that is also about what are the kind of inequities are there in the world and how do we help address those. And for that, we have a whole range of what we call power of difference communities that we've created around various cohorts. It could be around women who are out of the workplace. How do we help bring them back? Because we realize that there is a lot of experience sitting with people who have left the workforce. And how do we unlock that over time? And not just for ourselves, but for the larger community. Second area that we are focused on is around, people, other cohorts, right? People with disabilities, LGBTQI plus communities. How do we look at veterans? People like that, various kind of cohorts of people who are out of the workforce or looking for entry into our domain, and how do we help them go through that process? And then last but not least is, like I mentioned earlier, we are very, very serious about our own operations. We are very careful and mindful of what is our own footprint. Like I said, in India, for example, 80% of all our operations are run through green power, right? I mean, we have some creative agreements with our landlords because we don't own our own offices. We work with our landlords who have green emission or green power credits, and then we use that as a mechanism to run our own operations. The only reason we are 80% is we are continuing to build new offices, and as those come online, we will get there at some point. And we have been one of the early people who have been only looking at electric vehicles as a mechanism to reduce our footprint for our own cabs and other things that we utilize. So anyway, so it's a 360, and we are still learning. I mean, I have to be candid that every interaction that we have with our customers, partners, stakeholders, we learn something new, and we try to incorporate that back into our own operation. So that's how we've been doing it.
Thanks, Ram. Really helpful and very comprehensive when you look at the all dimensions of sustainability and how you take care of it. Kutty, I know you started off and you said you'll cover it later. So this may be a good time of covering the human capital part of sustainability and some of the initiatives that you have at Tata Motors to address that.
Yes, ma'am. Since we are actually a product company, you'd normally think, we do work mostly in the area of products, and all our attention is about tailpipe emission, or it's about how we manage our factories. But that's only part of the story. And as Ram correctly said, unless we deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this ESG agenda is only on paper. So we may be the best the product team. We may really do great work in the area of our machines or in the area of our factories. But finally, at the heart of this question is, what is the diversity challenges that we are encountering? So normally when we would speak about diversity, we would normally talk about the gender ratios. And I'm very glad to say that over the past several years, the Tata Group, under the direction of our chairman, has been pushing on this, a better ratio in terms of more female colleagues who can participate in the workforce. And it has to be understood that in India, the ratio of the employed women in organized industries are relatively very different from what we probably encounter in the other parts of the world. Now, in the Tata Group, and specifically also in Tata Motors, we have something called the Second Innings Employment Initiative, which is called SKIP, which means, many young ladies or ladies who have to take a break either for, their maternal needs or for their family needs, and they have to drop out of working for some period of time, have an opportunity to come back into the working stream. This is just one example of including a larger community into the workforce. That said, many of our policies related to maternity leave or related to paternity leave now, or the inclusion for LGBT communities, or related to the handicap, though it is now talked about in the ESG framework, for several years, it has always been there. So when I joined as a GT or a graduate trainee engineer on the shop floor many years ago, the wise leadership of the Tata Group had already inculcated a mechanism by which we could have partially blind or relatively fully blind people in our operations, may not be doing some sundry work, but who are participating in a manner where their dignity is preserved. So of course, it has its own challenges, but the community inside the company and outside is very sensitive to this. This is related to, and the policies are also getting enhanced to incorporate a larger set of such people in the workforce. That said, we are also mindful that being a product company, we can play a much larger role. Let's take a case of a specific set of people who are handicapped and they want to become drivers. Drivers who can actually carry people in the public space, or he wants to be a Ola or a Uber driver. A typical automobile may or may not be sensitive. We have to be sensitive to the fact that he or she may not be able to drive that way. So we are at times encouraging even these type of connections, and we are mindful that the product, once it becomes more automatic, then you realize that a person who doesn't have access to his left leg now is potentially capable of becoming more enabled. So similarly, if you're talking about people who can newer ADAS features, which is called automated driver assistance features, will enable these people to become better. So diversity and inclusion is at the heart of our conversation. But when we come to equity, equity is something that we manage basically through our CSR programs. And there's something called affirmative action, which is something that we are taking it very, very seriously in the Tata Group. And we ensure that people from various communities, whether it is scheduled castes, tribes, or others, also have access. So the whole question that the Tata Group stands for is, how do you bring access and availability to a larger set of our population, which is not divided on the basis of religion, caste, color, sex, language, or otherwise. So it's all about equity and inclusion, and it's also bringing a larger set of people of our population into the fold of an employable set of people, and therefore it's a very holistic approach here that we look at. So I was very pleased to hear what Ram had to say about what he does in his company. And I'm quite surprised that we all think similar, perhaps because we all from the ESG framework, where we recognize that our arrogance as a human being has to give way to humility as a human being. And that is what sustainability is all about. Can we keep our arrogance away as a human being? And can we be a little bit more sensitive to those beings who are less enabled or more disadvantaged than all of us are? So sustainability is that, when entrenched correctly, takes away the negative elements in a human's mind and replaces it with all positive thought processes to start with. So that's a small answer to the large question, if it helps.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, because I think it's so important to create that level playing field, right? Because there are certain sections of the society or talent or human. It's not just women, it could be people, as you rightly said, who are differently abled or who haven't had all the similar opportunities for access to education or other opportunities. It's all about how do you create that level playing field so that there is really an equal opportunity from an equity perspective as well. So I like what you spoke about, the affirmative action. So thank you for sharing.
I want to add something here, ma'am, if I
sure.
Ram, do, as we can do all these hard things like we can have targets and so on and so forth, but nothing replaces volunteering, what Ram referred to.
Yeah.
In a big way, because it connects the sensitive elements to something which is far beyond what he's encountering on a daily basis. So we encourage we have a Tata volunteering initiative where people voluntarily give their time. The company also participates in that. And once when it gets kicked off, you'll find so many initiatives that volunteers take up. It could be in old age home, it could be about planting trees, it could be caring for pets and animals, it could be caring for wildlife, it could be going to probably schools in the remote parts of the country, it could be caring for the sick and elderly. And during COVID, these teams have done something spectacular without too much publicity or too much talk. So volunteering has a very important role to play. Thank you very much. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kutty, for sharing. I do remember Ram also mentioned a lot of these initiatives that they have, especially for women. So that's really nice. But tell me, how do you get the employees to be aligned to these initiatives and to volunteer? What is it that you as leaders do to help and support them in this journey? And Ram, the question's for you.
If Ram's not online, can I take that question?
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So, leaders have a very large role to play in all these things. Many of these are top driven. It's like, the family head. And unless the mother and the father decides to do certain things, children probably would be less inclined to do some things. So leaders have to show the way. They have to probably volunteer themselves. And the choice of what you want to volunteer is completely left to the people who are volunteering. So there are people with multiple facets. Some of them are probably good at taking care of the elderly. Some of them would probably want to distribute food. Somebody would want to plant trees, and somebody would like to take care of pets. So encouraging them to find their piece is what a set of leaders have to do. And ensuring that all this is within the broad framework of volunteering and encouraging them to give their time to meet these objectives and to encourage them to say, okay, all volunteering is good. so that you learn something from this and you bring back to the table a feeling of belonging to the community to which you're contributing in a big way, is what leaders have to show the way. But leaders would be less of a leader if they only talk and they don't do. So action has to precede, what we talk. And we're very mindful over several years in the Tata Group that all our leaders lead from the front, especially with reference to ESG and volunteering. And we take this very, very seriously, simply because our founder, Jamshedji, always believed that, the stakeholder, the community is not just a stakeholder, but it is the very purpose of our life. So, ma'am, that's what we come from, and leaders have a very big role to play. And we as leaders cannot shirk our responsibility of leading from the front, setting the agenda, and being seen where leadership matters. So that's how we do it. There is no golden bullet for this, but it's only about practice, which has to precede the speech. That is what we believe. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Kutty, for sharing. I think we're still waiting for Ram to join back. But let me ask you another question, since we are talking about technology and the new emerging technology. So how are you in Tata Motors leveraging some of the new technology like AI, ML, Internet of Things to build cars for the future?
This is a very futuristic question, ma'am, and I'm glad that you asked. So if I may probably just for the listeners to understand, you would probably find that in 1901, when we had the first car, or in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, we had a car. We still had a steering wheel, and we had 4 wheels, and you had a driver driving, and you had the headlights, and then you had an engine inside the bonnet of the car. And same thing with trucks. And if one were to ask what has happened in these 100 years, 150 years, what's different? You still have a steering wheel and you have the bonnet, and with an answer inside the bonnet, you have the engine. But if you were to compare, forget about 100 years, if you would probably compare even 10 years ago, the engine, which was purely a mechanical device, is no more just a mechanical device. The engine gets driven basically by electronics and software today. And the lines of code that is probably there in a car today is far greater than, Ram will confirm this, than probably the lines of code that took the Apollo 11 to the moon in 1969, So the lines of code has completely changed. So you have in your car, the lines of code which are hugely different. Or the computing power which is in our cell phone or in our car is far, far greater than probably what we saw even 10 or 15 years ago in very major programs. Now, what is different is therefore that electronics has come into mechanical devices, and now there's a new field called mechatronics. And mechanical engineering is not replaced by electronics engineering, but is being supported by electronics engineering and computer engineering in a very big way. So actually, a car is no more a mechanical device. It is like a MacBook, which is on wheels. So, just imagine that, you put 4 wheels to the car, and therefore the driver of that car is probably the battery. So you have a MacBook or a laptop computer, which has got a battery. So you have a battery inside the car, and you have some software which is running the devices. So we have to all imagine really that the car is no more a mechanical device that takes you from point A to point. And now we are getting into an era of something called connected car. So connected car is when we talk about IoT, where you have a number of computer chips, and they are called electronic control units. And each device, whether it is the engine or the gearbox or the brakes or the airbag system or the anti-lock braking system or the electronic stability program, ESP systems, you name it. And there will be, so an ordinary car, a mass market car will have not less than 14 to 20 ECUs or electronic control units. And these are high-end, very high-end computing chips doing what probably a laptop or telephones do on a constant basis. Now, what does this do? It generates reams and gigabytes and terabytes of data, which is there for optimization. So perhaps if we were probably talking in terms of fuel economy in terms of say 10 kilometers per liter of car, with all this software coding and data that you have generated, the day is not far away where probably this number can be multiplied by some factors. So, the journey is, so it's all about optimization. And now coming back to the safety question, that I talked about, where we are talking about airbag deployment, a typical crash is probably an event which takes place in 1/100th of a second. It's called 100 milliseconds. So in 1 second, if I were to break it into 10 parts, in 1/10th of that 1 second or 1/100th of that second, the crash event is completed and the person is hurt. You can't deal with these sort of events if you go only mechanical. And that is why airbag deployment or anti-lock brake deployment, etc., happens in deep computing space. And therefore, the connected car is a reality. And when you have a connected car, data getting churned in terabytes of data. So this data is available. It is getting released to the cloud. So a lot of algorithms are constantly looking at optimization. A lot of apps can optimize various different things and can make things better for the consumer. Also, there was a time, or even today, we still think of electric cars. And we probably say, we need an electric car and we need to charge it. And therefore, we need a charging system, which is charging the car at home and so on and so forth. Perhaps the day is not very far away where we'll have a reverse, where the car is so capable that it can provide all the power to our home. So the vehicle and the products that we see today are going to be very, very dramatically different in years to come. And that is led by IoT, it's led by machine learning, it is led by artificial intelligence. And the good news about this, and Ram is an expert in that area and he can tell you more, that artificial intelligence and machine learning is telling the humankind certain counterintuitive phenomena and outcomes which human beings could never imagine. So the human mind is capable of doing X, but artificial intelligence and machine learning, along with the human mind, can probably do 100 times, 1,000,000 times what X was able to do. So on a happy note, I can say, though the external facets of a car or a truck remain the same, the truck is not at all what it was even 10 or 15 years ago. And what you'll see in the next 15, 20 years will be very different from what we are used to seeing today. What do you think, Ram?
No, I think you framed it very well. Like when I said every business is becoming a digital business, that is the point I was getting to, is that, and it's not just, I'm being a mechanical engineer by background. And by the way, Kutty, I used to design car suspensions for about decade of my early part of my career. So it is. And when I look back, right, I mean, all the points that you're making are absolutely valid. I think this is changing so rapidly also. And it's an interplay, right? I mean, when we think about technology, it is not just digital technology. It's playing a role. I mean, if you think about the pandemic and the speed with which people were able to generate vaccines, in unheard of speed, it is an interplay of technologies. I mean, it is decades of research that has probably come to pass. But a lot of that is now the intersection between digital, biology, mechanical, all of these different pieces coming together to actually make it happen. The downside of it, of course, is we are moving so quickly, including AI, that the ethics of AI is becoming a very important discussion, because there are unintended consequences, I think, to the point Kutty was making, because we don't know what is going to come out of it. I mean, we've had examples of where I think Google or Facebook was doing research where two AI started talking to each other and cut the human out of the picture. Now, the question is, they had to actually shut down the computers to actually prevent it from taking off on its own without knowing what is the unintended consequences. So I think but I think the things like sustainability, governance, the ESG goals, I think part of this is also to frame those contexts of technology, and all of us being technologists at some level are very enthusiastic about the future, about where we are going, etc. But there is a small thing that is also coming up saying, okay, what is the consequences of some of these things? And we have noticed that, right? I mean, all of us who've been kind of working from home for the last year and a half, while technology has made us productive, but now the big discussion is around mental health. Is it really good for us to be, locked up in our houses from, 8-hour, 9-hour, 10-hour days where we're staring at a screen and interacting with people in 2 dimensions? We don't know. I think these are all raising questions, which will probably create the next level of innovation of how do we actually look at some of these things, or do we just go back to some of the things we used to do and dial back on things that that are coming up? So we don't know. I think there is a lot we don't know, and we'll deal with it as we go along.
Absolutely, Sumit ma'am, I can't help add a couple of sentences to what Ram very correctly said. The ethical dimensions of many of these are not understood.
Yeah.
And if happiness is at the fulcrum or at the goal of human existence, and evolution gives a great amount of priority to that human happiness, how does all this contribute to that fundamental goal is something that we'll have to really talk about.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of conversation of the algorithmic bias which exists today. And so the data, whether that's technology, data science is dealing with, is it skewed to some extent, resulting in some of the results, which then get skewed because data itself is skewed, how it's looked at, and what kind of algorithmic biases there may be. So I think all of these are very interesting. Yeah.
So I'll just give you, I'll give you a real example. I mean, even about 2 years ago, there was a theoretical exercise in AI which said, how will AI make a decision? If it had to say, I mean, there are these problems that people pose, right? I mean, a vehicle is going down the road or a train is coming down the track, it has to fork. There is a young person on one track and there's an old person on the other track.
Yeah.
And the system has to make a decision which direction to go, because both of these has a consequence.
Right.
That was a theoretical discussion 2 years ago, and this used to come up in various forums. Guess what? In the pandemic, when doctors had to decide who gets a ICU bed and a ventilator, this is the reality.
Yeah.
It is the same decision. It is not any different. Now, if you leave that to a machine to make that decision, it will come up with an answer. Whether we like the answer, I mean, there's no emotions built into it. I mean, maybe AI will get emotions at some point, but these are decisions they need to make. Anti-lock braking. I mean, think about it. A sensor-driven car, which is completely autonomous, driving down the road, has to make a decision at split second. What would it do in a situation? If it's a human being behind the wheel, they may make a decision in one way. A machine may make a decision completely different than how we are thinking about. Do we build our biases into the machine or not? Do we build those emotions into the machine or not? These are all important, research topics that are still testing. I think we're very early days right now. Yeah. While AI has gained a lot of prominence in terms of from a dialogue, but we don't know. I mean, a lot of these are algorithmic, and they're still very much about the person who created those algorithms, and their biases are built into it. The training models have testing. So we don't know, and I think it's a crossroads decision. And as technologists, we are conflicted. How much technology do you use? How much technology, So it's a very interesting dilemma that the world is landing.
Sumit, I just would like to say, just to put it in context, we all use WhatsApp,
yeah,
and we sometimes send messages across, and we are looking at seeking a response, and we are looking at that the screen, and we know that the gentleman or lady on the other side, or whoever is on the other side, is typing a response, right? Now, who has designed the system? Some designer who has designed this system has designed the human interface in such a way that he recognizes that the human emotion connects with looking for a response and is waiting for that typing so long so that message comes. This sort of design done by a set of people somewhere in some corner through some tech, they could be some 4 or 5 or young people or old people who are designing the system, and the whole world is probably working its psyche and emotion based on just a simple example. What I said, just imagine that is going to an automobile. The human, the design of the system has become so much important, and therefore it has got a lot of debate. And it comes back to this fundamental thing that we talked about earlier, which is that no more are we talking about independent systems acting in isolation.
Yeah.
It is also an ecosystem play where ethicists, people from the legal dimension, from the mathematical dimension, from the physics dimension, the humanities and the humanistics dimension, they all come together to create a holistic, sustainable solution to the world. This is what I think I could draw from what Ram was trying to engage us in.
Yeah, and I really wanted to thank both of you for being here with us today. A really interesting, engaging discussion, and a lot I'm sure that our audience takes away, including some of the discussion we just had in the last few minutes about the ethics of it and how much technology rules humans or humans rule technology, and who takes the final decision. I think these are all things that technologists of the future and the generations of the future and a lot of our audience will find very interesting and areas to research upon, and let's see where it takes us. I mean, sometimes I think of the science fiction movies we used to see a few years ago, they are all coming to reality today. And so what seemed like fiction a few decades ago is what we see reality. So thank you very much. I really appreciate both of you taking the time on and joining us today. And just to recap, as we said, sustainability is not something that we're looking from the short term, but it's something which will give us the long-term gains. And sustainability also doesn't mean sacrificing profits. It's all about ensuring that whatever strategies and operations each of the organizations are spending their time on, but are doing it in the interconnected and the interdependent world, so that we will see not only more profit and growth, but also better human capital practices and more equity, more social justice, and hopefully have a better resource planet and a good way of leaving a legacy behind. So thank you very much for joining in. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ram.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
Good.
Thank you.